Welcome to the Real News Network, coming to you from the McClatchy offices in Washington, D.C. It was a big day here in Washington. President Obama, along with Senator Clinton, announced their new foreign policy initiatives, and President Obama signed executive presidential orders undoing Guantánamo and some of the excesses of the last 8 years.
In order to effect the appropriate disposition of individuals currently detained by the Department of Defense at Guantánamo, and promptly to close the detention facility at Guantánamo consistent with the national security and foreign policy interests of the United States and the interests of justice, I hereby order. And we then provide the process whereby Guantánamo will be closed no later than 1 year from now. Any interrogations taking place are going to have to abide by the Army Field Manual. We believe that the Army Field Manual reflects the best judgment of our military, that we can abide by a rule that says we don't torture, but that we can still effectively obtain the intelligence that we need.
To help us understand what happened today, we're joined by Steve Thama, White House correspondent for McClatchy Newspapers. Thanks, Steve.
Good to be here.
So give us the highlights. Start with the executive orders. What happened?
Well, this day was really a lot about sending a message. I mean, rarely do we have a coordinated day at the White House where all morning, afternoon, all the events kind of tie together. This was one of those days, and the message was to the world, more than to an American audience, that there's a new sheriff in town, things are going to be different. He signed 3 executive orders, one to close the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, another to close all CIA secret prisons around the world, and another to restrict the kind of interrogation techniques they use on prisoners or suspected terrorists, to basically ban a lot of the more aggressive techniques, such as waterboarding, that have been very controversial here and in other countries.
The executive orders undo some of the, what many people consider excesses of the Bush administration, but also something a lot of people think was illegal under the Bush administration. If torture is defined as illegal, and waterboarding has been defined as torture, then what does he do about the fact that Cheney and Bush admitted to authorizing waterboarding? Now, is that, I know nothing publicly happened about that today, but it's kind of an obvious contradiction here. Is there any conversation happening about?
Well, there's a lot of conversation, and the President and the White House so far have signaled that they are not going to prosecute anybody from the previous administration. There's a lot of political pressure in Washington, particularly from the left, from some more liberal Democrats, such as John Conyers, who's a member of the House of Representatives from Michigan, to not only investigate but prosecute people for these things. The White House has signaled very strongly they are not at all interested in that. Barack Obama has said he's not interested in that.
I don't believe that anybody is above the law. On the other hand, I also have a belief that we need to look forward as opposed to looking backwards.
So no 9/11 commission with independent subpoena power?
You know, we have not made final decisions, but my instinct is for us to focus on how do we make sure that moving forward we are doing the right thing. That doesn't mean that if somebody has blatantly broken the law that they are above the law, but my orientation is going to be to move forward.
Now, in the foreign policy initiative, did we hear anything from President Obama that we wouldn't have heard from another president? Now, clearly differences from President Bush, especially term 1. But is there anything that's different about this from the traditional American foreign policy, excluding President Bush?
Some of the rhetoric, some of these lines, we heard George Bush say. I've been in town since Reagan. We've heard all the presidents talk about we're going to be very involved, like in the Middle East. Well,
Bush was going to get us a peace agreement before the end of his term.
They all are going to play a key role, aggressive. They name envoys. They all end their terms so far without results. So yeah, in that regard, the rhetoric is not that dissimilar.
Israel's our ally. Not even a hint of critique about Gaza, where much of the world, including many representatives of the United Nations and many countries, have talked about, at the very least, a disproportionate response by Israel vis-a-vis Gaza. But no suggestion of that today.
Let me be clear. America is committed to Israel's security, and I will sustain an active commitment to seek 2 states living side by side in peace and security.
I thought there was one interesting piece of the Obama speech at the State Department towards Hamas, is he didn't say terrorist organization Hamas, and I may be exaggerating, but it seemed to me the words Hamas never came out of President Bush's mouth unless the word terrorism was connected with it. But here, Obama laid out 3 things that Hamas could do to sort of get back into the process.
To be a genuine party to peace, the quartet has made it clear that Hamas must meet clear conditions: recognize Israel's right to exist, renounce violence, and abide by past agreements.
I mean, those 3 things in themselves, I guess, aren't new, but the idea that you could talk about here Hamas is a way for you to become a legitimate player that we would even recognize, I think there's a suggestion there. Is that, at least in tone, different than what we've heard before?
Perhaps. I'm not sure. I don't know how deliberate it was in that case not to use the word. The word would marginalize them more and lock in the U.S. position more if he used that, or if he uses it in coming days. We were speaking earlier. It was a very noticeable question that came up in the press briefing over at the White House this afternoon. Robert Gibbs, the press secretary, having his first briefing with reporters today, was asked specifically, why did you not use the words war on terror in the documents on Guantánamo and the other policies changed today?
When he was signing the order today banning torture, he referred to the ongoing struggle against violence and terrorism. He did not refer to the war on terrorism. I want to know if this is purposeful. Has he decided to drop the war metaphor?
I think the language today was consistent with what he said in his inaugural address on the 20th. I'm not aware of any larger changes in that.
There's been no decision not to use that phrase?
Not that I'm aware of.
You started the interview saying this day was to send a message to the world. So in a word, the message is this new sheriff in town. But what do you think the world's going to take from this that the new sheriff is going to do?
I think most of the world's going to wait and see. I mean, the biggest one is the closing of this detention facility in Cuba. He signed the order today, but he gave them a year to do it. There's still a lot, I wouldn't call them loopholes because that's too pejorative a term, but there's a lot of things yet to be worked out. Domestically, of course, we talk about where are all these prisoners going to go. There's some fear they'll come into American cities. But the other side is, for instance, in response to a question today at the briefing, a senior administration official told a group of reporters they don't yet know that they won't reserve the right to hold detainees indefinitely. They could still have that right.
Just not in Guantánamo.
Just not in Guantánamo. So I think the world that watches these things closely is going to wait and see.
Thanks very much.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.